We want to welcome to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center for virtual field trip. We want to say a special welcome to Hulsey STEAM Middle School. Teachers, if you're watching and you're not signed up, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/6-8 registration and sign up for us, please. The program this morning will be body systems. During this virtual field trip, students will investigate how organisms respond to external stimuli found in the environment, such as fight or flight. Students will also describe and relate responses in organisms that may result from internal stimuli, such as fever or vomiting in animals, that allow them to maintain balance. Mr. Ramirez will discuss fight or flight. Mr. Monroe will cover fever, migration, and hibernation will be discussed by Ms. Ram, and Mr. Dominguez will cover vomiting. During this program, you cannot ask us a verbal question, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer and send in your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them during the program. And now, Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you about fight or flight.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning all about the fight or flight response. So before we get started, I do have an animal friend that I would like to show you guys, and I'm going to give you some clues to who that animal is, and then I'll let you guys make your guess. So the first clue is that this animal belongs to class Reptilia. This animal is native to Australia. It has 4 legs, a long tail. It has spikes on its body, and it is a cold-blooded or ectothermic animal. This animal also will inflate its beard of skin when it feels scared or threatened, or to show its dominance. So go ahead and make your guess to who this animal is, and I'll go pull him out. And if you guys guessed a bearded dragon, you would be correct. So this is Spike, and he is a bearded dragon. They get that name because they have a pouch or a beard of skin underneath their chin. So when they get scared or mad, they can inflate that beard to either scare away predators or to show their dominance. Now, Spike here is a cold-blooded animal, and that just means that they cannot regulate their body temperature. So they depend on an external heat source like the sun or a heat lamp to keep their body warm. So I'm going to go ahead and put Spike up, and then we're going to take a look at some other examples of the fight or flight response. And he was dressed up for Halloween. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and we'll take a look at a quick little video. So let me get that screen share started. So in this video, you're going to see some examples of responses to threatening stimulus. So we're going to look at the fight, flight, or freeze responses. And generally, I let my classroom animals, when we don't have students, they're just running around the room. And on this particular day, we had Lucky Bunny and Spike the bearded dragon. They somehow ended up in my chicken's cage. And this is a quick little video to show how they interacted with one another. So observe and describe their behaviors. And another word for the flight or fight response is the acute stress response. So pay attention and notice the behaviors of both the rabbit and the bearded dragon. So right there, you can see Spike kind of inflated himself. He's trying to make himself look bigger and more threatening. And he's also flattening his body and turning it toward Lucky Bunny. So he's definitely displaying more of a fight response. And poor Lucky Bunny didn't even know what was happening, and he ran away. So that was the fleeing response. Naturally, rabbits are prey animals, so they generally tend to run when they are afraid. And there is Lucky Bunny again. He's going to try one more time to investigate to see what that animal is. And you can see once again, Spike is standing his ground. He's inflating himself, and he's trying to make himself look more threatening. So again, oftentimes when they inflate that beard, it can often turn like a dark black color. Sometimes they will open their mouth and make kind of like a hissing sound as well. So this would be a good example of the flight or fight response. And the flight or fight response is simply a physiological reaction that occurs in the presence of something terrifying, either mentally or physically. Now, after a while, both the animals eventually got used to each other. And then here's an example of a little baby deer called a fawn. I happened to accidentally walk across it as I was walking the trails. Do you think its natural response is to fight, flight, or freeze? And we'll see. I think initially when I stepped upon it, it was super scared and kind of just froze in place because maybe it didn't know what to do. And then as I got closer, it just darted super quickly. So deer are fast runners and can jump extraordinary heights. So I'm going to stop that video and we're going to take a look at our presentation for the day. So let me share this presentation. Let's see if it will load. So the essential questions for today are, what is a stimulus and what organ systems are involved in stimulus responses? The second question is, what is the fight or flight response? And you should be able to give some examples. So generally, the fight or flight response is a response, again, to something terrifying. It can be because of a predator. It can be due to competition for a mate or for resources. So there's a variety of reasons why the fight or flight response would be taken into effect. So another example of this is with my two dogs. So we have Abby over here on the left, the brown dog. She is naturally a dominant dog and she can be more aggressive and protective. Toby, who's the black dog, on the other hand, he's naturally just very shy and loving. And a perfect example of the fight or flight response was I was walking with my dogs at a state park. We happened to come across some wild or feral hogs. Abby immediately darted toward the hogs like she was trying to attack them. Meanwhile, I had Toby on the other hand, who was running behind me trying to get away. So it all happened in like a split second. And I just totally froze in place because I didn't know what was going on. So you can see we each had different reactions to a stimulus. In this case, the stimulus was those feral hogs that we came across, and our responses, again, were different. So Abby chose to fight. She went into attack mode. Toby chose to run. He was trying to run away. And I just froze because I just didn't know what was happening. So essentially, the fight or flight response is your body's natural or automatic response to danger. Again, it can be predators, a fearful situation or an object, and social situations like competing for mates or resources. Again, it's not a conscious decision, but you can train your brain to react differently in future occurrences. And then here's just an example in case you don't know what a feral hog looks like. These happen to be some feral hogs that were trapped at the EEC. So feral hogs are an invasive species. People don't like them. They're very destructive. So let's get more into the fight or flight response. So the fight or flight response, again, is your body's natural response to danger. It's automatic. It's not a conscious decision. It can be based on natural personality. So some people are just natural fighters. Some people are just naturally going to run away from danger like me. And then it's also based on some previous experiences or encounters with that particular stimulus. So I've said the word stimulus several times. A stimulus is just anything that causes a reaction or a change in an organism. A stimulus can be external. So you'll learn about temperature later. It can also be internal. So things like hunger, thirst, and illness. You'll also learn about those later as well. And that stimulus will cause a reaction or a behavior. And a behavior is just a set of actions that are taken by an organism in response to a stimulus. And we saw some examples of those behaviors: the running, the fleeing, the fighting, or the freezing. So now let's take a look at what actually happens within the body. So it begins with your amygdala, and that's a part of your brain that you can see over here. And that amygdala is responsible for fear. It's going to send a signal to your hypothalamus, which is also in the brain, and it's going to stimulate the automatic nervous system. So the body system that is involved with The fight or flight is the nervous system, in particular, the sympathetic nervous system, but also the endocrine system is also involved because it releases hormones. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the flight or fight response. We also have the parasympathetic system, which drives the freezing response. So rabbits will often do that, freezing when they get fearful or threatened. And then it's also important to note that the nervous system is stimulated by the release of adrenaline and cortisol, and those are stress hormones. So those hormones actually increase your heart rate, and that increased heart rate increases blood flow. That way you can run if you need to. It increases your breathing, which also increases your oxygen intake. Your pupils will dilate. That way you can see better. You'll start to sweat. You might get goosebumps. And then blood will be increased to your major muscles. And then that's how come your body's diverting all your blood to your important muscles. Meanwhile, things less important like your hands, they might tend to get cold because that blood's being diverted to more essential body parts. So there's a variety of things that go on with your body during this response to help you either run or fight. And then a common example here at the Environmental Center, the stimulus would be stinging insects. We have a ton of them out here. We have a lot of wasps and bees. And then a common response to that stimulus, we often see kids swatting them either angrily or crying. We often see kids running away from them. We see kids exhibit the freezing behavior where they're just sitting really still and they don't know what to do while these flying insects are around them. But oftentimes it's a lot of crying or screaming. So those are responses to a common stimulus out here, the insects. I will tell you the best thing to do when there is a stinging insect around you is just to freeze. Don't swat it because you're just gonna make it angry. They're just trying to smell you out and see what you are, and then they'll go away. So that's the appropriate response. And then here's just a quick example of how the fight or flight response is related to people. So think of situations where you might fall into these categories. So for people, there's the fight response. It could be not necessarily just fighting somebody, but it could be getting a temper or yelling, confrontation with other people, bullying, or like dictating other people. We also have the flight response as well. For people, it could be simply running away. It could be avoiding a problem, or just working yourself overboard so that you don't have to think about the problem. Freezing as it relates to people could be things like daydreaming or spacing out, or maybe just isolating yourself from others and the problem, simply just not doing anything. And then fawning as it relates to people, you're kind of like the people pleaser. You're scared to say what you really think, or you can't say no. So these are some examples of behaviors as it relates to people. So think about situations where you might fall into one of those. And my quick reflection question for you guys is to think of an instance where you have experienced the fight or flight response. How did you feel? And then do you call any of those physiological responses? Also think about what are some steps you can take in the future to help ease those effects. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and that's all I have for you guys today for the fight or flight response. We're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman to answer.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. One student wanted a brief description. Oh, by the way, if Mr. Spike comes around my house Halloween night dressed up in his outfit, I guess instead of a big bucket of candy, I'll have to have a bag of super worms for him. So if he's coming to walk at you, let me know. Now, the fight or flight response description requested by a student. The fight or flight or freeze response is a physiological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived harmful event, attack, or threat to survival. It was first described by Walter Bradford Cannon while he was a professor at Harvard's Medical School about 1925. And now Mr. Monroe is going to tell you about fever.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be going over something that probably we're all familiar with at this stage in our lives and what's going on around us. It's called fever. Well, guess what? Fever is a stimulus that is going to cause a response in a living body's immune system. And before I really get into what fevers really are and how they're helpful, I'm going to talk about homeostasis just for a little bit, because homeostasis assists our immune response when we do have a fever. Now, homeostasis basically is what maintains or what keeps things the same in our body. The body uses so much energy, even during the time that we're asleep, it maintains a constant internal environment. Now, homeostasis is essential for a healthy body. The immune system or the immune response contributes to homeostasis by helping fight off infections. Now, during an infection, molecules called pyrogens are released, which alert the brain to increase the body temperature, causing a fever. Now, these pyrogens, this is a substance produced by bacteria, which produce the fever when introduced or released into the bloodstream. However, fever helps the immune system. That is a benefit, and I want you guys to remember, fevers are not really bad, they are beneficial. And just here lately, I got a vaccination, and I'm sure the last couple of days, I wasn't feeling up to par. In fact, the first night after I got the vaccination, I do believe my body temperature, my core temperature, and let me explain something about core temperature. Core temperature is the deep inside temperature of our body. Now, there are major organs that are in our body that have to be maintained at a temperature of 37 degrees Celsius or somewhere around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the normal temperature that we should all have. Now, infections cause most of the fevers that we get. You can get a fever because your body is trying to kill off the virus, the bacteria that may have caused that infection. The heating boosts our immunity by sending disease-fighting cells to that point of infection. Just like I said before, a fever may be good for us, whether we're a baby, whether we're teens, or whether we're adults, or even whether we're senior citizens like myself. A new study and several other studies shows how it speeds infection-fighting cells to where they'll do the body good. Now, as far as the temperature that all of us should be ranging between, common or the average temperature for humans, that body temperature should be at 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. It can be a little bit lower. You see, older people, their body temperatures, their core temperature may be just a little bit lower. I had Miss Rolfe, the admin out here, take my temperature this morning, and I was surprised. I just come from outside, the wind is blowing and it's cool. My body temperature was actually 94.1. Now that's a little low. So here, after a while, when I finish this presentation, I'm going to have her take it again, and I bet it has come up. Now, there is a treatment that we can use, or first aid that we can use to bring a temperature down. Now, if your body temperature gets up around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that is an indication that you may have a fever. And there is something that you can do to bring the fever down. You can take Tylenol, ibuprofen, Advil, or Motrin, and that will have a tendency to bring the fever down. And that's exactly what I did the other night when I could tell that I was having a fever. Today, I feel a lot better because the fever or the temperature, my body temperature, has gone down within the normal ranges, and I can definitely tell the difference in the way I'm feeling, okay? Now, do animals, do they have fevers? Sure enough, they do. And I'm going to use for an example, a dog. You know, a dog's normal temperature should range between 101 or 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. When that temperature gets above that of 103, that dog is considered to have a fever. Now, if that temperature gets up to 106, woo, that's a problem. Serious or fatal complications can occur. Now, it's kind of hard to tell whether your pet dog, and I picked a dog for a good example because I believe most of the staff out here, we do have pet dogs. And I picked that for a reason because I'm kind of concerned about my dog. Now, it's hard to tell when a dog does have a fever. You might keep an eye on their behavior, but there is one way that the old folks used to say, if you touch that dog's nose and that dog's nose is cold and wet, then the dog is fine. But if the nose is dry and hot, that's an indication that maybe that dog has a fever. And if the fever gets so high, just like I said, if it gets up around 106 degrees Fahrenheit, it's best to take the dog to the veterinarian. Now, there's a way that you can take the dog's temperature, and usually it's going to take a couple of people because you will have to use a rectal thermometer, digital thermometer, and it will have to be entered into the rectum and held there for a little bit to take a reading. And usually it takes, two people to do that because you know how dogs can get. They can get a little fidgety. Well, right now I want to show you a couple of instruments that are used to take temperature, body temperature, even though we're taking it from the outside. Here lately, because of the COVID, a lot of places that you go into, they're going to take your temperature simply because if you have a above normal temperature, they're going to say, well, I don't think we can let you in. You might need to go be tested for COVID because it is an infection that's going to cause you to have a fever. One such instrument is this digital thermometer that actually is placed close to the forehead, and the person that's taking the temperature presses a trigger and it gives a digital readout on the back. Now, at my house, we use a digital thermometer, and basically it's the kind that you put under your tongue and you hold it there for a few seconds or at least a minute until it beeps, and then you can take a reading there. And then therefore, you know that if you're above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then you definitely have a little fever. And again, fevers are the signs that you probably got some infection. And fevers are not all good. I mean, they're not all bad, simply because you know that your body is responding and there is a battle, a fight going on to kill that infection, which is causing you to feel bad, or even an animal to feel bad. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman. So if any of you have any questions, I bet he can answer those for you. You guys have a good rest of the virtual field trip and a good day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And we did have a question or a request. Give a brief, precise definition of fever. A fever is a temporary increase in your body temperature, often due to an illness. Having a fever is a sign that something out of the ordinary is going on in your body. For an adult, a fever may be uncomfortable, but usually isn't a cause for concern unless it reaches 103 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 39.4 degrees Celsius or higher. Then you probably need to see a doctor. Now we're going to have Ms. Schramm tell us about migration and hibernation.
Good morning, everybody. It's Ms. Schramm, and we are talking all about migration and hibernation this morning. So, what is the point of migration and hibernation? Well, as we enter the winter months, it's getting cooler out, and animals need to survive, and they don't typically survive in these cold temperatures. So some animals migrate and some hibernate. So we're going to go through some examples of both. So first, let's talk about migration. So migration is a seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. So this is when you see birds and butterflies and other animals moving south to stay over the winter. So the example I have first is the butterflies. Right here, you have monarch butterflies, and they're actually coming through right now. They're finishing up their journey down to Mexico for the winter. So let's get into hummingbirds first, because they also were just coming through Texas. So this is the ruby-throated hummingbird. And a few weeks ago, we had hummingbirds like crazy out here at the Environmental Center. Ms. Ramirez has a few hummingbird feeders, and she was always having birds outside her room. I loved watching them in her garden. So I put some feeders outside of my classroom too. But now is not the time because they already kind of went through. So hummingbirds are one of the smallest birds on earth. They're teeny tiny, like this big, and they're very beautiful, and they move so quickly. Their heart rates beat at 1,260 beats per minute. And their wings, they can flap them from 15 to 80 times per second. And that's like 200 times per minute. So that takes a lot of energy, especially when they are migrating. They use a lot of energy in their tiny little bodies. So they have to make frequent stops along the way to drink nectar from flowers and to get strength to move on the rest of their day. So when they're migrating, they fly low because that's where the flowers are. They fly low and in the day because that's when our flowers are blooming and open. And then they travel on and then they rest at night. So they typically gain about 25 to 40% of their body weight before the trip because they can go all the way from Canada to Mexico. So it takes a long time and a lot of energy. Here's a map that shows you where hummingbirds are and when they are there. So like I said, the first section is all the way up in Canada, and that is in May and September. So you can see in the yellow, it's color coded so that you know where they would be. So in May through September, they're all the way up north. Then they travel down to the Northeast and the Midwest in April through September. And then March through October, they are in the South and our area of Texas. So October is when they start to leave us and go down to Mexico. So through October and February, they are down south, they are in Mexico, and the butterflies have a similar pattern. So during October and September is a great time to see the hummingbirds traveling through. So you'll see a lot more. And we have hummingbirds, like I said, March through October. So you could see them all spring and all summer as well. So I told you that the monarch butterfly has a similar pattern. They do the same trip, but they do it a little differently because they are insects, they're a lot smaller, and it takes them a long time to get where they need to go. So insects don't live as long, of course, as birds. So monarch butterflies, unfortunately, they only live once they're in the adult stage from 2 to 6 weeks. So that's not enough time to travel that far, especially with just a tiny little bug and big old wings. So that's a long time. So it takes them in the spring 4 to 5 generations to get up north. So they start in Mexico and it takes them 4 to 5 generations to even make it up north. Then in the fall migration, they do something special. So the butterflies, the monarch butterflies you see all spring and all summer that are all around, those are just regular monarch butterflies. They live 2 to 6 weeks. Then at the end of summer, the last generation that's born is called the super generation. And I've just recently learned about this. It's really cool. So the super generation can live 8 times as long as the regular monarch butterflies. They're larger and they make the trip down to Mexico in 1 generation. So because they live 8 times as long, they're able to go the entire trip just one generation. The only disappointing part is they cannot reproduce. So a super generation is not going to make another super generation. Once they pass, they don't have babies. So it has to start all over again with regular butterflies. So their map is similar to the hummingbird map. Of course, they start up north and they move down south. And those red arrows are showing the fall migration. And then, of course, the yellow is showing the spring migration. So it also has different labels for where milkweed grows, which is a plant that they rely on. And yeah, so the butterflies, they also travel in October. So like I know last week there was a lot of monarchs outside of my classroom. I have like a little pollinator garden and there was a lot of monarchs here, but they're kind of finishing up their trip and moving south. So if you look, you might be able to see some still making their way. Let's see. So I wanted to talk about some plants that you can grow to help both hummingbirds and monarchs on their journey, because they all travel through Texas, and there's a lot of plants that they love to visit. So plants that are red, yellow, purple, pink, all those bright flowers, they love to visit. They're attracted to all those bright colors. And one plant that I love to grow here in North Texas that I have at home and at school is the lantana plant. So lantana, the birds love it, bees love it, and butterflies love it too. So it really attracts them. It's got all those bright colors that they love, and they stop and visit all the time. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm also going to show you a plant that we have that grows really well and really aggressively out here at the environmental center, is Turkscap. So it has these little red flowers, teeny tiny little red flowers, and the butterflies and the hummingbirds love this flower. They drink the nectar from it and they move on. Ooh, sorry, a ladybug fell off. I wasn't expecting that. Okay, so see, there's an example. Everybody loves the Turkscap. So there's certainly different plants you can plant. Like I said, all those bright ones, if you get perennials, they'll come back year after year and save you money and time, and you'll help all those little birds and bees and butterflies on their way. Then I also have a monarch butterfly specimen. So this is just a regular monarch butterfly, but this is what they look like. So if you are outside and you're trying to see those butterflies as they move, you'll see they have orange and black, and they have white spots on their wings. So you can look for those. And then one more thing that I have to attract the hummingbirds, like I said, Ms. Ramirez has some, and so do I. We have these hummingbird feeders, and all you have to do is add your hummingbird nectar. There are also recipes online if you want to make your own with sugar and water. And yeah, they love it. So I've been getting a lot of visitors up until recently. Now they're all kind of scooting on. But either way, it's really fun to watch. And you can get bird feeders like that just at Walmart, wherever. All right, so let's get moving on to hibernation. Okay, so hibernation is a way that animals conserve energy to survive adverse weather conditions or lack of food. So for animals that cannot just fly away and move south, they are stuck where they're at, so they have to figure something else out. So they go into a dormant state that's called hibernation. Now, hibernation, a lot of times people think of like a bear going into a cave and sleeping the entire time. It's not necessarily like sleep. It's similar to a sleep state. It looks like they're sleeping, but they're just in a dormant state where they are processing less, they're using less energy. It's kind of like when your phone or tablet, usually they call it hibernate, but it goes kind of dark, it's using less energy, it's not really active, but it's not actually sleeping. So that is, oof, this ladybug, I'm sorry guys. So hibernation involves physiological changes such as a drop in body temperature and slowed metabolism. So they don't have to eat as much, they're barely eating, they're eating stored fat in the body, they're not having to get up and go crazy. So here's a picture of a black bear. And like I said, they're not always sleeping, and you do wake up, like they do get up during hibernation a lot of times, eat, use the restroom a little bit, then go back. So people think that it's like months straight of them in hibernation, not doing anything, but they do wake up and kind of warm up, move around, and then go back to their hibernating state. So there is a difference between hibernation and brumation, depending on what kind of animal there is. So endothermic animals are animals that can regulate their own body temperature by generating internal heat. So those are mammals. We are endothermic. We are warm-blooded. All those warm-blooded animals, they can produce their own heat. Ectothermic animals are those whose body temperature depends on ambient temperature, and cold-blooded. So ectothermic animals go through a similar process as hibernation, but it's called brumation. So instead of hibernate, it's brumate. But they do a similar process. It's just another dormant state where they're using less energy. That's all it's about, is conserving energy. So some bats hibernate and some migrate, depending on the type of bat. But either way, the cold weather, they do have to conserve that energy. So whichever way they do it, if they do hibernate, they go into a cave that's cool and damp. And like I said, it looks like they're sleeping, but actually they're just using much, much less energy, significantly less. So their heart rates when they're resting in normal state is 210 beats per minute. When they're flying, it's 1,365 beats per minute. Now, when they go into their hibernation state, they can bring their heart rate down to as low as 20 beats per minute. So that's significantly less. So they're really not using much energy at all. So their metabolic rate basically falls to about nothing. And then they also mate in the fall. So they kind of go on a feeding frenzy. They mate in the fall, and then the females wait and kind of start creating the baby, and they have their babies later in the spring. So it's kind of weird. This process slows while they're in that hibernation state. All right, so snakes and other reptiles, they go into a state of brumation, like I said. So the snake is kind of curled up. He's got a little hole in the tree, and he is brumating, and he's just resting in there. Aquatic reptiles like alligators and turtles, they have to go to the water. So they kind of live in the mud and the muck, and they stay under the water. And I'm going to introduce you to one of my friends that would have to brumate, but since it's my pet, he don't have to because he has a heat lamp all year. So I will introduce you to my little turtle right now. Okay, so he's a little shy and a little annoyed because I took him out of his tank. But this is my little turtle. He's a red-eared slider. If he does decide to stick his head out, we'll be able to see his little red marks on the side of his head. But anywho, so like turtles and alligators, they go all the way under the water to the bottom of the pond or the lake or the river, wherever they live, because the water temperatures are more stable down there. So they can stay under for a long time, like 100 days. So turtles can survive in 37-degree temperatures for 150 days. And they can survive freezing temperatures for only 11. So they have to stay pretty low into the water so that they don't get those freezing temperatures. Mr. Monroe has a turtle in his room. It's not a red-eared slider, it's a big snapping turtle. And over this winter freeze, he went into a state of brumation and survived. His tank had like this much ice on the top of it because we lost power out here, and his turtle was able to survive. So it's definitely true that they do brumate. And I wish he will come out, but it looks like he's a little too shy. So maybe next time. All right, I hope you enjoy your field trip, and I will see you next time.
Thank you, Ms. Schramm. Hibernation and migration are adaptations for animals to survive winter months when food is not available. Hibernation is when animals rest or remain asleep during the entire winter. Migration is the movement of animals from one place to another. They eat extra food and begin storing it as body fat. Example of hibernation is when bears eat a lot and sleep most of the time during the winter. Example of migration is when ducks fly south for the winter. Now, Mr. Dominguez is going to talk to you about a very interesting subject called vomiting.
Hey guys, I'm here with Dumpy, the White's tree frog. Another name for White's tree frogs is Dumpy frog, so that's why I call him Dumpy. And it's his dinner time, but I've already tried this a couple of times and I don't think he's hungry tonight. But he's going to help me introduce a very, did you guys see that? That's one of his defense mechanisms. He's got various defense mechanisms, but we are going to talk about, and he's going to help me introduce the topic of vomiting. And it's a very common occurrence among animals, and it helps us maintain homeostasis. And the reason I chose this guy to help me talk about vomiting is because he does it all the time. So whenever he eats something that might not sit too well with him, he pukes out the entire content of his stomach, and the stomach kind of comes out too. So his stomach comes out of his mouth. So he literally pukes his guts out. So we say that all the time as an exaggeration, but he actually does it. And I think he's kind of upset with me, so I'm going to leave him alone. But we are going to talk about vomiting today. So let's get started with our presentation.
In order for us to understand why vomiting is a necessity, we have to understand what homeostasis is. Homeostasis is maintaining a stable internal environment. So your body has a ton of different processes happening all at once. And in order for those processes to function properly, we need to maintain homeostasis. So your body wants to maintain a body temperature of 98 degrees. It wants to maintain adequate blood pressure. It wants to maintain proper glucose levels for all of those bodily functions to happen properly, the way they should. However, our body is constantly having to deal with external stimuli, and our body has reactions to those external stimuli to maintain homeostasis. So for example, think of what happens when you go outside and it's too hot. So you start beginning to feel really hot. And if your body gets too hot and its body temperature begins to rise, your body's reaction is to sweat. That is an example of homeostasis. Now let's go back to vomiting. So what happens when you eat something that is not supposed to go into your body, something that is making you sick? Well, one of your body's responses is to throw it back up, to vomit. So let's get started with a little bit more about vomiting. All right, guys, let's talk about the physiology of vomiting. And vomiting is actually a pretty complex process with a lot of moving parts. But like any other involuntary response to external stimuli that our body has to maintain homeostasis, we have to start in the brain. And we are going to start in the medulla oblongata, where you will find two zones that control vomiting. So the first zone is called the vomiting center, and the vomiting center controls the vomiting reflex. So all the muscular processes that happen during vomiting, the unpleasant feeling that you guys get, the tightening of the stomach, the funny feeling you get in your throat, all of those things are controlled by this zone. And this zone works together with another zone called the chemoreceptor trigger zone. And this zone basically scans your blood for things that should not be there. So substances that can harm your cells. So the cytotoxic things that will harm your body. So think of bacteria, think of viruses, think of chemicals that should not be in your body, alcohol. So all of those things get scanned or will bind to special receptors in this zone and will cause vomiting. So these two zones are constantly talking to each other and figuring out when your body needs to vomit and maintain that homeostasis that we want. Now, something that I learned while researching this was that people who undergo chemotherapy and have to take these different chemicals and substances in order to kill cancer cells, they have a higher tendency to feel nauseous during this treatment and to feel like they need to vomit all the time because this CTZ zone is constantly being triggered by those chemicals in their drugs.
So did you guys know that not all animals can vomit? So rabbits, like Bun here, don't have the ability to vomit. So if she were to ingest something that might not be good for her or could harm her, she would either have to pass it or I would have to take her to the vet. So think of vomiting as a blessing in disguise. Not all animals can do it, and sometimes they get into trouble for not being able to vomit. So I know that I am thankful that my dogs can vomit because, boy, do they get into some pretty bad stuff. So anyway, I hope you guys learned a little something about vomiting, as strange as this topic was today. And I hope to see you guys next time for your next virtual field trip. Until then.
Thank you, Mr. Dominguez. And we have a student who wants to know a little bit more. Vomiting. What is vomiting? Vomiting or throwing up is a forceful discharge of stomach contents. It can be a one-time event linked to something that doesn't settle right in your stomach. Recurrent vomiting may be caused by underlying medical conditions, and you might need to see a doctor. Some common causes of vomiting that's not medical is vomiting can have causes that aren't due to underlying diseases. Examples include hangover, pregnancy, overeating, or motion sickness. All of these can cause you to vomit. Now we have some synonyms for vomiting, and now you may have some of your own that I'm not covering. It's upchuck, regurgitate, hurl, puke, retch, or heave. Thank you. What a great way to end a program on with vomiting. And now I'm going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students investigated how organisms respond to external stimuli found in the environment, such as fight or flight. Students also described the related responses in organisms that may result from internal stimuli, such as fever or vomiting in animals that allow them to maintain balance. Mr. Ramirez told you about fight or flight or freeze. Mr. Monroe discussed fever. Ms. Schramm, migration and hibernation. And again, Mr. Dominguez just covered vomiting. Thank you for joining us. If you would, teachers, go to www.tiny.cc/feedback and fill out a short form and send it to us. We would appreciate it. Thank you.